afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Bligh Street and welcome to the 2025 Owen Harries Lecture to be delivered by Rose Gottemoeller. As is customary, we begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet. I'm Sam Roggeveen, Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute, and we're here today to discuss one of the most important international security issues of our time, the unprecedented emergence of a great power nuclear triumvirate, the US, Russia and China. But we're also here to mark the legacy of a great Australian foreign policy thinker and entrepreneur of ideas, Owen Harries. Owen was a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute, and we're honoured to mark his contribution to Australian and global foreign policies through this lecture. And before I introduce our speaker today, we thought it appropriate to first hear from Tom Switzer. Tom was a great friend to Owen later in his life, and Owen, I think it's fair to say, was something of a mentor to Tom. Tom Switzer, as well as being a friend of the Lowy Institute, is the Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Studies and a regular commentator on international affairs in the Australian and many other publications. Tom Switzer.
Thanks, well, Sam, thank you very much, and thanks also to Michael Fully Love, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute, for inviting me here today. Michael could not be here, and Rose, great to have you with us. Owen was a Welsh-born conservative academic who eventually became a prominent policymaker and diplomat in the Australian government in the 1970s and early 1980s, before he became the founding editor of the Washington-based National Interest magazine from 1985 to 2001. I came to know Owen very well in the mid-1990s when we both lived and worked in Washington. And in those days, Russia, and we have to remember this is just a few years after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Russia was no threat to the West and was incapable of serious military action. But Owen used to warn, and this is what he wrote in the New York Times in 1996, that if humiliated further and made desperate, Russia could be dangerous in a way that a wounded animal can be dangerous. Its potential to be a troublemaker was huge. According to Owen, a sick Russia with a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons would one day get well and declare its own Monroe Doctrine. Owen was a leading opponent of the Clinton administration's decision to expand NATO eastwards. And this was his argument after America's Cold War victory. And remember, he was, like other prominent opponents of NATO expansion, a Cold Warrior. He said, quote, "Expanding NATO violates the wise principle enunciated by Winston Churchill. In Victory Magnanimity, Churchill was no softy, but he recognised the stupidity of grinding the face of a defeated foe in the dirt. As early as 1993, in a widely quoted essay in Foreign Affairs magazine, Owen warned of the perils of any proposal to intrude US military power and even security guarantees into what Russia had long seen as its sphere of influence. Quote, "It would greatly annoy the Russians, but it would have little credibility, create splits within the alliance, and could even require much in blood and treasure. To incorporate Eastern Europe into NATO's sphere of influence at a time when Russia is in dangerous turmoil and when that nation's prestige and self-confidence are badly damaged would surely be an act of outstanding folly. It would be a catalyst that would enable extreme chauvinistic elements in Russia to exploit frustrations, resentments, and wounded national pride in ways that would have unpleasant consequences both internally and internationally." And Owen, his more profound point was this: beneath all the proposals to move NATO east lies a relic of Cold War thinking, the concept of the political West. The West, as a strategic entity, was a product of the Cold War, Owen argued. But the West has been and will remain a culture and civilization. but the Western political unity of the Cold War will eventually give way to differences of interests and strategies as America and Europe search for their own security. Now, bear all this in mind when you reflect on the very real differences between America and Europe on how to end the crisis in Ukraine. And I mention all of this because Owen believed that NATO expansion would lead to big trouble with Russia. And so, by the way, did key architects of the Cold War doctrine of containment, most notably George Kennan and Paul Nitze, as well as Cold War historians John Lewis Gaddis, Richard Pipes, Robert Conquest and Sir Michael Howard. Indeed, officials in the Clinton State and Defence Departments also opposed NATO's plans to expand eastwards. They included the Polish-born chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Shalikashvili, and the Defence Secretary Les Aspin, as well as his successor William Perry, who considered resignation in late 1994 when the policy proposal moved forward. Of course, this way of looking at NATO expansion and Russia today is very much a minority view, and it in no way justifies Russia's incursions in Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, much less its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Still, historical context does matter, and at the Lowy Institute we like to put events in a broader international and historical context, and I just thought I should put today's Harries Lecture in the context of Washington's debate over NATO expansion 3 decades ago, before we hear from Rose, and now again, Sam. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Well, as you've heard, if there's a subject that preoccupied Owen Harries throughout his life, it is relations between the great powers. So there couldn't be a better speaker to introduce to you today than Rose Gottemoeller, who will speak to us today for about 25 minutes before we sit down for a conversation, including, I hope, with all of you and your questions. Rose Gottemoeller is the Lowy Institute's 2025 Distinguished Fellow for International Security under a grant sponsored by the Defence Department. She succeeds Sir Lawrence Freeman and Elliot Cohen in this role. Rose is the William Perry Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Prior to this, she served as Deputy Secretary-General of NATO from 2016 to 2019 and was Under-Secretary for Arms Control and International Security at the US State Department. In 2009 and 2010, she was Chief US Negotiator for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, known as New START, with the Russian Federation. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Rose Gottemoeller.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I should say. It's a tremendous honor for me to stand before you today to give the 2025 Owen Harries Lecture. I did not have the benefit of Harry's tremendous wit and wisdom, but my colleague and friend, Frank Fukuyama, did. Frank worked with Owen to publish the famous article, The End of History, which appeared in issue number 16 of the National Interest in June of 1989, not so long after that important journal was founded. And I quote, "Owen's greatness as an editor," Frank wrote after his death, "became very evident in the way that he used the national interest to spur debate on the topic of what the new world order would look like after the end of the Cold War," end quote. And we just heard about that a moment ago. When I spoke to Frank, who's a colleague now at Stanford, I had the good fortune to meet with him just before I left on the Friday 2 weeks ago. He commented that, and I quote again, "If we have come full circle from Owen and I worrying about the excesses of American power at the time of the Iraq War to the United States withdrawing from the exercise of power today." Owen wouldn't have been any happier with that outcome, said Frank, and I can but agree with him. I am not happy with either outcome either. Today I've been asked to speak about one of the symbols of US power, the US nuclear arsenal. And how it must now contend with not one, but with two major nuclear powers, the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. I was a participant in the 2023 Strategic Posture Commission in the United States, and so became well acquainted with the nuclear threats that will burden the United States and its allies in the years to come. Our charge on the Commission was to consider the security environment that the United States will face out to the 2040s, in line with the recognition that Beijing will be celebrating a century of the People's Republic of China in 2049, that's 100 years from 1949, and has set out some alarming goals for itself toward that anniversary. And yet, I do see the possibility of reaching some accommodation with China, at least on matters having to do with nuclear weapons. There has been a good deal of alarmism in Washington about the nuclear threat of China. In my view, it is one we must take seriously, along with the nuclear threat that Putin's Russia continues to pose. However, of all the threats that China poses, political, economic, military, I believe that the nuclear threat is among the most manageable. I will tell you why, and also speak about where we stand with Russia and nuclear weapons. But let us start by considering where the nuclear matter stands in the United States nowadays. In an interview on Fox News on March 9th, President Trump made his views on nuclear weapons known. I quote him here. "We spend a lot of money on nuclear weapons. The level of destruction is beyond anything you can imagine. It's just bad that you have to spend all this money on something that is, if it's used, it's probably the end of the world." And nobody ever talks about nuclear weapons. They don't talk about the dangers of a nuclear weapon. What could happen tomorrow? I watched Biden for years say our greatest existential threat was the climate. I said, no, the greatest is sitting on shelves in various countries called nuclear weapons that are big monsters that can blow your heads off for miles and miles and miles. End quote. That is not the first time that Trump has used colorful and powerful language to describe his worries about nuclear weapons. In fact, he has made some comment about nuclear weapons almost every week since he returned to office in January of this year. And he has been thinking about the problem of nuclear weapons for a long, long time, since he was a real estate magnate in New York in the mid-1980s. At that time, he asked George H.W. Bush if he could negotiate a strategic arms reduction deal for him. So our president has been thinking about nuclear weapons for a long time. Of course, we cannot take everything that the president says at face value because he does change his mind all the time. But I will say there is a consistency to his focus on nuclear threats and the need to control them. They are not, in his worldview, a good investment of money. They cannot be used because if they are, it will likely mean the end of the world. I spent a good deal of time on this wind-up today because I think the president is serious about confronting nuclear dangers. He is frustrated that he was not able to achieve success in this area during his first term in office, both in his efforts to negotiate with Kim Jong-un in North Korea and his efforts to bring China and Russia to the table for a big nuclear deal. Both of these efforts came to naught. He is determined to try again, and I think we need to do what we can to encourage and facilitate his effort. I am going to use this speech to say what I think might be achieved with Russia and with China in the coming period. My ideas do not add up to denuclearization, which is what the president has said he wants to do, but they do end up to significant success in re-engaging with the Russians to advance nuclear arms reductions and to engage with the Chinese for the first time on measures of nuclear control. And that's an important distinction: nuclear control, nuclear limitation, and reduction. I will not further speculate on what a negotiation with the DPRK or indeed with Iran might look like. The president's spoken about that several times. And I will not talk further in this speech about extended nuclear deterrence to our allies here in Asia or in Europe. I know those have been hot topics in the press, so if you'd like to discuss them during our Q&A, I'm happy to do so. But I'd like to focus in on Russia and China and the United States, as we say, the nuclear triumvirate in this speech. Where US-Russian nuclear negotiations are concerned, I see the easier pathway because we and the Russians have been at this business for over 50 years and know each other well. We were implementing the New START treaty successfully, even in the midst of the first Russian invasion of Ukraine when they seized Crimea in 2014, and afterwards, when we started up to the point of the second invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Since I first got into the field in the 1970s, and we were at each other's throats during the Cold War, I have always felt that we and the Soviets, now the Russians, needed to continue to control, limit, and reduce nuclear weapons, no matter what else was happening in our relationship. The reason is simple. Nuclear weapons represent an existential threat to humanity. The Russians felt that way too until, as I said, Russia's second invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and Putin's decision to halt implementation of the New START treaty, which came a year later in February of 2023. My opinion, backed up by some comments out of the Kremlin, is that resumption of implementation and the launch of negotiations to replace the New START treaty, which goes out of force in a year from now in February of 2026, these should be quite possible as part of a normalization of US-Russian relations in parallel with a process to halt the war in Ukraine. New START goes out of force in February of 2026, and many people are asking me, well, are we going to fall off a cliff at that time with rapid increases in nuclear weapons inventories in Russia and the United States? My answer is no. We have gone through a long period in the 1980s and the 1990s when no nuclear arms reduction treaty was in force, and the United States and the USSR simply agreed to abide by limits that had been agreed through negotiation. That is the story of so-called SALT II, the SALT II agreement. I would suggest, however, that Russia and the United States agree publicly to sustain the limits of New START for the foreseeable future. That's 1,550 deployed warheads and 700 deployed delivery vehicles, missiles, bombers, and so forth. This would occur while the new limits are being negotiated. At the same time, the United Kingdom, France, and China, the other nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, should commit not to take any steps that would undermine the limits of the New START treaty. Each of those countries, the other nuclear weapon states under the NPT, UK, France, and China, could each in parallel commit not to undermine the limits of the New START treaty. Which brings us precisely to China. China is modernizing its nuclear arsenal apace, and here, as in Washington, there's a large concern that China is seeking to become a peer competitor of the United States in nuclear as well as conventional forces. The US Department of Defense has estimated that China could build as many as 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035, up from 500 to 600 total today. This has led, it's led to real concern that the United States is about to face what we call in Washington the two-body problem, that the United States could face two nuclear powers, Russia and China, deploying similar numbers of nuclear warheads. It is a worst-case scenario. Let me say clearly and firmly a few words about that worst-case scenario. I do not dispute that the United States must plan against worst-case scenarios. It is the responsible thing to do, both on behalf of the United States and behalf of our allies also in Asia as well as in Europe. They depend on us for nuclear deterrence. However, it is also important to keep the limits of the worst-case scenario in mind. The DoD believes it is possible for China to build 1,500 warheads by 2035. I mentioned that a moment ago. The United States and Russia each deploy 1,550 warheads under New START. This is the origin of the two-body problem, 1,500 in China by 2035, 1,550, Russia, United States. But China will have 1,500 warheads total, while the United States and Russia each has approximately 5,000 weapons total. The Federation of American Scientists, our best non-classified source on this, says that Russia has 5,580 warheads, and the United States 5,044 warheads. The Chinese might decide to deploy every one of those new warheads, but normally they would keep some number of them in reserve and as spares. If it was forced to, the United States could operationally deploy more warheads by uploading the ballistic missiles and attributing more warheads to the bomber force. Again, these are technical details. I'm happy to go into them more if you're interested, but there are ways to get more warheads targeted against our likely adversaries. To upload, the United States would have to step out of the limits of the New START treaty. Therefore, it's important that China pledge not to undermine the limits of the New START treaty. So that's the inception of my proposal. They shouldn't undermine by building up above 1,500 warheads, certainly, or deploying that number. So let us consider what it will be possible to achieve with China at the negotiating table. First, it's important to remember that we do not have the long experience negotiating with the Chinese that we have negotiating with the Russians. I mentioned that long 50-year experience. I benefited from that experience myself at the negotiating table. Our teams, both on the Russia and US sides, very experienced and had been working together for a long, long time. But we haven't had that same experience with the Chinese. But we're not totally bereft of experience with them. They are part of major multilateral regimes such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which, although it has not been entered into force, is being prepared for implementation. So there's a lot of interaction on the CTBT as well. And they are currently chairing the so-called P5 process among the NPT nuclear weapon states, the UK, France, US, China, and Russia, and are doing so even as we speak. They know what the issues and stakes are in nuclear negotiations and what is required to maintain strategic nuclear stability. At the same time, they have wrapped themselves in resistance over the years, saying that their nuclear forces are so much weaker than ours that the transparency required for nuclear diplomacy would exacerbate their vulnerability to our much larger force. When you and the Russians both reduce to 1,000 nuclear warheads, the Chinese have said, then we will talk. They have kept that stubborn silence throughout recent years when they have clearly been modernizing their nuclear forces, building new ballistic missiles, submarines and bombers, and acquiring additional warheads. When it became clear that they were building 300 new silos for their intercontinental ballistic missiles north and west of Beijing, they insisted for the longest time that these were not silos, these are a wind farm. This stubbornness has been a great source of frustration to Donald Trump in his first term and also to Joe Biden. Both of them tried to get the Chinese side to talk about their nuclear modernization, and both failed. Why do I think this time might be different? First, I think Trump's approach might be more realistic this time than last. During his first term, his team tried to shoehorn China into the New START treaty, making them part of a nuclear reduction treaty with two vastly superior nuclear countries, the United States and Russia. It did not make sense, and the Chinese reacted by shutting down all willingness to talk. This unwillingness extended into the Biden administration, when Biden thought he had agreed with Xi Jinping to begin nuclear stability talks, but the Chinese simply refused to come to the table. This time, however, New START is going out of force, so there will be something of a clean slate to start with, at least with the Chinese. There will be no legally binding treaty to try to shoehorn them into. Although, as I said a moment ago, they can and should be ready to support sustaining the limits of New START if Russia and the United States agree to do so on a bilateral basis. Second, the signals that are coming from the Chinese in Track 2 meetings have been more positive and open than a year ago. A year ago, and I take part in a lot of Track 2 meetings, a year ago, whenever Chinese experts were asked about their nuclear modernization in Track 2, They were not allowed to speak about it. We got the wind farm story. In the last 6 to 8 months, however, they have become more open, admitting that a nuclear modernization is underway, but emphasizing that it is consistent with their long-standing nuclear doctrine. That nuclear doctrine holds that China will never threaten a first strike, but instead will depend on nuclear retaliation should another country strike it first with nuclear weapons. It is on that basis that China has maintained a, quote, no first use, unquote, policy, which it is now proposing that the other nuclear weapon states embrace in the form of a treaty. You might have heard something about that. When they are pushed about the seeming inconsistencies between their nuclear modernization and no first use, the Chinese insist that their modernization is all about bolstering their retaliatory forces, not about rushing to parity with the United States and threatening a first strike. In fact, they say point blank that they are not rushing to parity. We should not take any of this at face value and maintain our skepticism. But the way in which the Chinese are opening up suggests to me that we can have a real conversation with them about minimizing nuclear risks and increasing predictability between us. That is why I'm more confident than I was a year ago that we can enter into talks with the Chinese not about reducing and limiting nuclear weapons, as we do with the Russians, but about controlling nuclear risks and enhancing nuclear predictability. This is nuclear arms control, not nuclear arms reduction. We will see in coming months whether my prediction has any truth to it. There are many possible stumbling blocks along the way. We do not know, for example, how much the Trump administration will actually want to talk with the Chinese, and vice versa. There are many China hawks in Washington, and there are many American hawks in Beijing. The trade war, also underway, does not help. Although President Trump evidently is keen to talk with Xi Jinping, that may not spell new nuclear negotiations. It depends whether the president's interest in controlling nuclear weapons extends as strongly to the Chinese as it does to the Russians, and for that matter, to the North Koreans and Iranians. Again, he has put proposals out in recent days about reconnecting with Pyongyang and also with Tehran on nuclear talks. My instinct is yes, but there's no evidence of it yet, and I do want to underscore that. We do not know yet what President Trump's approach to the Chinese will be on this matter, aside from the fact that when he has talked about major nuclear reductions, he's said again and again it should involve not only Russia, but also China. Despite these unknowns, I will risk laying out my recipe for Washington to deal with the nuclear triumvirate in the coming period. I would suggest 2 parallel negotiations. One with the Russians to extend the limits of New START beyond February 2026, and to seek new limits on all nuclear warheads deployed and non-deployed in reserve and on active deployment, so to say, and on delivery vehicles, especially new exotic systems, such as Russia's Poseidon nuclear-propelled and armed torpedo. Again, the focus with the Russians would be on new limitations and reductions. With the Chinese, a parallel negotiation would focus on nuclear arms control, limiting nuclear risks and enhancing nuclear predictability. It would not require the Chinese to reduce their nuclear weapons, but it would require them to be more open about where their nuclear modernization is headed. The main point I'd like to emphasize in speaking to you today is because of the differential in how quickly they can acquire nuclear warheads, we do not need to panic. As I said at the outset, we have 5,000 nuclear warheads. If we need to upload against an increasingly aggressive China and Russia, we can do so. But at the moment, we have a window of opportunity to pursue new reductions with the Russians and new limitations or controls with the Chinese. One caveat here. The Chinese have evidently tested a fractional orbital bombardment system, or FOBS, in this ocean south of the equator. I know you are worried about it too. We're very worried about it in Washington. On the Strategic Posture Commission, we proposed as one of our recommendations that the United States seek an outright ban on FOBS. This is one proposal to limit a nuclear system that I would press with the Chinese as well as with the Russians. A final point. I am agnostic about whether the United States should seek new legally binding treaties with either the Russians or the Chinese. Many people in Washington these days say it will be impossible to gain the advice and consent of the US Senate to ratification of any new nuclear arms treaties. I'm not so sure. With President Trump exercising such strong influence over Congress, my view is if he presents a nuclear arms control treaty to the Senate, they are very likely to give their advice and consent to its ratification. Again, we will have to see. Political agreements, if they are well crafted and contain measures to assure implementation, can also be very, very effective. You may be surprised at my optimism about handling the nuclear triumvirate in the years to come. I am by nature an optimist. But it only occasionally gets me in trouble. During negotiation and ratification of the New START Treaty, I kept getting reminders, even from inside the government, the US government, not the Russian government, the US government, that I would never get the treaty over the finish line. I think my steady optimism that we could, in fact, achieve what we set out to do was irritating to some, even in the White House, but we did manage to do it. And moreover, we got the advice and consent of the Senate to ratification. I came away from that experience with the conclusion that countries like to limit and control nuclear weapons. They are an existential threat to humanity, just as President Trump says. And when a leader succeeds at nuclear arms control, kudos come to him or her from all over. Presidents tend to like that. So let's see what we can do. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Might you take that one, Rose?
Take your hand.
Thank you. Why don't you take that one, Rose? Sorry.
Okay, got it.
Rose, thank you very much. There's much we can talk about around the specific proposal you'd outlined, but the job of a think tank, after all, is to consider first principles, to ask the hardest questions. And on this particular topic, the hardest question I could think of for someone in your position is what you think of nuclear weapons per se. You've spent your career striving for a safer nuclear balance, as you said, to limit and control nuclear weapons, consistent with US interests. I think I'm right in saying, though, that you are not an abolitionist. So I wondered, given the terrible destructive power of nuclear weapons, why aren't you an abolitionist? What is the moral case for nuclear weapons?
I am actually an abolitionist in the sense that my entire career has been nailed to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty calls for the eventual reduction and final elimination of nuclear weapons. That is Article 6 of the NPT, and that is the legal superstructure under which we have advanced nuclear arms limitation and reduction over the past now 60 years since the first Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement of 1972. So I do believe that we must work, because they are an existential threat to humanity, to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons with the goal of getting to zero. This is also consistent, by the way, with President Obama's point of view in his famous Prague speech. And I worked for President Obama. Under his aegis, I was the chief negotiator for the New START Treaty. So I believe this is a goal that we must sustain and maintain over time. I have to say that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is out of fashion at the moment. Not that many people think it's that important, but I do think that it is extraordinarily important because it does provide the legal and policy underpinnings under which we continue to reduce our Cold War overbuild of nuclear weapons. If I may just comment briefly, I talked about the US and Russia each having approximately 5,000 warheads. That's a lot of warheads. But during the Cold War, we built up to extraordinary numbers. By some accounts, the Soviet Union built over 40,000 nuclear weapons total nuclear warheads total, and the United States built over 32,000 nuclear warheads total. So we have come down a significant amount since the years of the Cold War, but we need to continue to press that agenda, and the agenda takes place, in my view, under the aegis of the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime.
So that leads me back, though, where I ended my question about the moral case for nuclear weapons. If ultimately we do want to reach abolition, you must believe then that a world with no nuclear weapons is safer than a world with nuclear weapons.
Well, I don't believe that that world exists today. And I think you're also pointing to the frustration that has, over the past decade, produced the so-called TPNW, the Treaty to Ban Nuclear Weapons, and to make them illegal, because there's a strain of feeling that the NPT simply hasn't delivered in it came into force in 1972 as well. So in the 6 decades of its existence, it has failed to deliver. And therefore, on that basis, a group of very, I would say, sincere and well-committed people have banned nuclear weapons and gotten a lot of countries to come along with that, with the notion that nuclear deterrence cannot be a kind of moral position to sustain and maintain. We need to simply ban them as we ban slavery and get rid of it, even if we're imperfect in getting rid of slavery. Nevertheless, we ban it and we work steadily to get rid of it. In my view, and President Obama said this very well in the Prague speech, as long as nuclear weapons exist, we must ensure that they are maintained in a safe, secure, and effective way. Effective because should the terrible day come when someone threatens the United States or its allies with nuclear weapons, we must be ready to respond. And I believe that. I don't love nuclear weapons, but as long as nuclear weapons exist, they must be maintained in a safe, secure, and effective manner. And that's the conundrum that we're addressing now.
Yes, it is a strange feature of international security scholarship that it's assumed people involved in that world actually like the thing that they're studying, right? We don't assume that doctors like cancer.
Yeah.
But somehow...
Well, yeah, that's a very good point, Sam. And I must say, thinking about the issues for those who work in our nuclear weapons establishment in the United States, that's one of the things that has really bugged me, frankly. I'm being very frank about the TPNW folks, because they say those people are immoral. What they are doing is immoral. Well, if you're maintaining nuclear warheads at a facility in one of the US laboratories, you believe the work you're doing is correct and that you yourself are moral in doing it. And I feel the same way in supporting that policy, but it does place a burden even on some blue-collar workers who are involved in the complex, or our military forces who are serving to ensure that the operational deployment of nuclear weapons can be sustained, that somehow what they're doing is immoral, and I believe that that is wrong.
Yeah. Now, you began your remarks with a long quote from President Trump, who, whatever else we may say about him, I think deserves some credit for recognising the existential danger, as you noted, of nuclear weapons. When you think about the various catastrophic risks to humanity, do you think that in our time that the dangers of nuclear war are underrated at present compared to, say, climate change or pandemics?
They've been on the back burner for a long time. That's one of the reasons I support what the president said when I quoted him saying, nobody ever talks about nuclear weapons. They very much are on the back burner of policy. They very much are on the back burner of public awareness. We're nowhere near where we were in the 1980s when we had the so-called ban movement. People were out on the streets protesting the coming deployment of nuclear missiles in Europe. It was an extraordinary moment of public awareness and action regarding nuclear weapons, but we don't see that today. I've been thinking in my current work that perhaps if we could link up climate activism, which among young people is a very burning issue, with support for continued attention to nuclear limitation and control, that would be a good way to go, because if nuclear weapons ever get used, they will have a profound effect on our climate. And so, there's a link there, but somehow I haven't been able to arouse that kind of enthusiasm. And I 100% support the work that younger people are doing on climate change and tackling that problem, which is also an existential threat. But I would like to see a bit of balance come back into it and awaken interest in nuclear weapons as well.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to try to link your remarks with the introductory comments made by Tom Switzer, which revolved around European security. What has been the role of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine conflict since the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022?
Right. And Tom, we can have a nice chat about this afterwards. As former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, you will appreciate I may not agree with all of the folks you quoted, but nevertheless, I do think those are very important points to make about the real debate that occurred in the 1990s about the enlargement of NATO and what has happened since. And I will say, furthermore, that I very much support the work that the NATO allies have been doing to support the Ukrainians in their war effort to really stand against this aggression from the Russian Federation. But with regard to nuclear weapons, it's been astonishing to me, again, because since the Cold War, I've been very much brought up in my career with this notion that we were working with the Soviets and with the Russians to reduce and eliminate this threat eventually of nuclear catastrophe, nuclear holocaust. And to see suddenly this nuclear sabre-rattling emerge, not in 2022, but after the 2014 seizure of Crimea, the nuclear sabre-rattling first emerged from the Kremlin, and then it really heated up during the period after the February 2022 attempt to seize Ukraine as a whole. And to my mind, what was so interesting during that period was that there was a performative aspect to it, a kind of way to try to deter the United States and NATO from doing too much to support the Ukrainians during that period. But then it morphed into a kind of operational potential when the Russians were being really quite pushed in the southeastern parts of Ukraine in the fall of 2022. They were being pushed out, and there was a fear that they would be really defeated in the southeast quadrants of Ukraine. And at that time, apparently, according to reports in the US press, Washington was convinced that there was a 50-50 chance that nuclear weapons would be used on the battlefield. I was on the Strategic Posture Commission at that time. As you can imagine, when I first heard those words in Washington, my hair stood on end because I was very, very worried that it could happen. We hadn't seen anything like it since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in the end of the day, evidently, Putin backed off on the advice of his general staff. Again, all of this has been reported in the press. But it was a moment when we could have seen the potential for actual nuclear use on the battlefield for the first time since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So we have had this performative aspect of it, the nuclear saber-rattling aspect of it, and we've also had a threat of actual nuclear use. So I think it's been a very concerning picture what the war in Ukraine has shown us.
And the period you're talking about in late 2022, it's recounted, I believe, in some detail in Bob Woodward's book, latest book, I think called simply War.
Yes, that's those are the media reports. Bob Woodward's very good at getting those kinds of stories out of people.
And my recollection of that is that Woodward ascribes a great deal of the credit for talking Russia off the ledge, if you like, to the Chinese.
Absolutely, and I do want to give due credit not only to the Chinese, but also to the Indian Prime Minister as well. There was a wonderful, for me, a wonderful scene. This period I was talking about was September, October into November of 2022. And at a summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Kazakhstan in November of 2022, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi both publicly said to Putin, do not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. To me, this was an astonishing moment because these three guys, I'm sure, talk together a lot, but they do not talk about each other in public in this kind of way. And for them to be on an international media podium and to say, do not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, I thought was extraordinary. So I give great credit to the Chinese, apparently continuing this trend after 2022. They continue to steadily message Moscow not to even think about using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but also I give credit to the Indians.
I'd like to take some of your questions now, so if you please raise your hand if you have one. In the second row here, please.
Thank you. Welcome, Rose. Great to hear you. I'm a former Australian diplomat, Jane Hardy, and I also participated in your wonderful International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification over a decade ago for 3 or 4 years, and that was really amazing and a 1.5 track event. People don't realise that the NTI was deeply involved, and it was very productive. My question actually was going to be about nuclear extended deterrence, but I hear something in what you're saying which is very reassuring, which is the other side of deterrence, assurance to allies and partners. We don't talk about this much, and in fact, probably in this day and age and these recent months, people are not feeling assured. Could you comment on that aspect? You know, how do we... I think the NTI have argued for a few years now to turn around the debate on deterrence, nuclear extended deterrence, to talk more about assurance. Could you comment on the mood around that language and whether that's having an effect? And related to that, like the IPNDB, is there a role for the non-nuclear weapons states, allies and partners in helping to push that language and that idea forward?
Absolutely, and thank you, Jane, for that question. There's a lot of ways to approach it. I would say, first of all, I want to give due credit to NTI, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, the work of the head of that organization, Ernie Moniz, and also Sam Nunn, former senator, who's the chairman of the board. They have put forward in recent years what they're calling a nuclear fail-safe review, and this is an aspect of assurance, where they're not saying that we need to sit down at a table and negotiate it, but they're saying each of the nuclear weapon states or states possessing nuclear weapons, we say nuclear weapon states are the nuclear 5 under the NPT, UK, France, China, Russia, and the United States. But nuclear possessing states include also India and Pakistan, include sadly now North Korea. So we really need to focus on all states that possess nuclear weapons, and that each of them should undertake what is called a fail-safe review to ensure that their nuclear weapons cannot detonate by accident or by unauthorized use. If somebody got their hands on a nuclear weapon, it would not detonate by unauthorized use, and there are mechanisms to assure that. So I thought this was a very responsible proposal, one that all of the states possessing nuclear weapons should be willing to embrace, and this would provide an aspect of nuclear assurance to countries around the world that these things couldn't accidentally detonate or get into the wrong hands and detonate. So there are many ways to go about tackling this question, but I do want to point just for a moment to an important line, because there's been a huge crisis of confidence among our allies. I've seen it here in Australia. I've also seen it in a recent visit. I was in Brussels the week after the Munich Security Conference. If you can imagine what that was like with the NATO allies, they were very, very concerned and frankly upset by the things the United States of America is saying now. So there has been this crisis of confidence. I liked what Pete Hegseth said. Actually, it was not on a public podium, but a week ago, his memorandum to the Pentagon was leaked in our press. And in it, he said, we, the United States, do not want dependence. We want true allies. We want allies. But the second part of that was to say, you provide for conventional deterrence and defense, build up your conventional forces, and we, the United States, will continue to provide for the extended nuclear deterrent. Again, that line was not said publicly. I think the United States, frankly, with this crisis of confidence that's going on right now, needs to reiterate that kind of point publicly to underscore U.S. continued support for the nuclear umbrella, for extended nuclear deterrence. But these are other aspects of assurance that we can talk about.
Rose, a quick follow-up. You talked about an accident involving a nuclear weapon or the possibility of unauthorised use of a state's nuclear weapon. When you consider all the scenarios and you do a sort of back-of-the-envelope probability assessment, what's the most likely way that a nuclear weapon is going to be used?
I have thought about this a lot in the context of the nuclear sabre-rattling, and I will just have to reflect on what we saw recently. I believe that it is out of a conventional war in a theater where one of the combatants feels he is about to be defeated. So, but there are continued and persistent worries about accidental use or unauthorized use. So I think, believe me, these are, we used to say less than 1% chance of these happening. But if an event like this happens with a nuclear weapon, it's a really bad day for everybody. So we have to pay a lot of attention. So it's hard for me to put a probability on it, but given what's happened in Ukraine, I have to say our nearest history speaks about threats arising from a local or regional war that escalate or could escalate.
It's an impossible question, but you dealt with it beautifully. Thank you. In the centre aisle here.
Hi, thank you both very much. Jeff Fine from Goldman Sachs. Quick question for you. You haven't talked about Iran, and obviously it's a bit of a different situation, but given your time with the Obama administration, it was obviously an important topic then at the time. How do you factor Iran into this discussion? Thank you.
Yes, and I am very interested. I'm not quite sure how the president and his team are formulating their proposals to Iran, but I've been heartened to see that they do intend to try, at least they say, to try to get back to the table with the Iranians to do a better JCPOA, as he says. By the way, if there's anything I know about Mr. Trump, is that he wants to do better than Mr. Obama. So he'd like to do a JCPOA that is better than Mr. Obama's JCPOA with, I think, as he considers it, fewer loopholes for the Iranians. So we'll see what can be accomplished there. It's a much different Middle East, obviously. It's much different at this moment in the relationship between Iran and its proxies in the area, Hezbollah and Hamas. The Iranian factor. The other thing that's very interesting now, it played during the first Trump administration, but the way in which the Trump administration very much wants Israel and Saudi Arabia to make peace in order to stabilize that relationship. And so we are at a much different geopolitical time overall. So I do not know what can be accomplished. I am very concerned that Trump pulling the plug in his first administration on the JCPOA has allowed the Iranians to enrich fissile material to a level very close to where they could use it to make a nuclear bomb. So we don't have that kind of warning time that we had in the period of the JCPOA. So perhaps that gives them a little added boost at the negotiating table, that is the Iranians. We will see. But now we've got the problem of actually getting them to the table, and the Trump team are pretty busy right now. I've been saying, they had three main goals as geopolitical objectives when they came into office, that is President Trump. One was a stable and abiding ceasefire in Gaza so as to move on to the other goals of the Abraham Accords, including this peace with Saudi Arabia, or between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That looks very dicey right at the moment, but it was a really good negotiation, and I was pleased to see how Mr. Steve, the name of the Steve, thank you, Witkoff, thank you, Tom. He was negotiating for President Trump, even as he was not yet in office, but working very well with the Biden team during that period. So there is a solid basis there, and I hope we can return to that peace process and on behalf of the Palestinians in Gaza. The second thing he wanted to do was peace in Ukraine, and he's hard at work at that. In Riyadh, even today, there are negotiations going on with Ukrainians and Russians involved. It's shuttle diplomacy, so they're not in the same room at the same time, but negotiations going on. That is an intensive effort. And then the third area is this nuclear weapons issue that I raised. So I'm a little concerned that the hierarchy places North Korea and Iran farther down the list but we'll see.
Who's at the back?
Thank you for your lecture. We talked a lot about the bilateral deal of the US. What's your opinion on the multilateral one? And do you reckon that the US will remain a major contributor to the International Atomic or Energy Agency? Thank you.
Yes, that's an excellent question. You know, it's been a bit traditional when the Republican Party comes into the White House, and it's not just a phenomenon of the Trump administration, but to raise questions about international organizations, whether support should continue. I very much support the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency because they have been absolutely vital to implementing this deal with Iran, the JCPOA, and in the aftermath, continuing to try to keep a sharp eye on what the Iranians are up to. We need their eyes, ears, and expertise, absolutely. And so just on that technocratic basis, I think the administration should very much continue to support the IAEA. And we also see it today President Trump has said very interestingly to me, he said he wants to take over the nuclear power plants in Ukraine. I don't know how feasible that is. President Zelensky's raised some questions about it, but here again, the IAEA has played a tremendous role during this war in Ukraine to ensure and try to sustain the safe operation of those nuclear power plants. They're shut down now, like Zaporizhzhia is shut down, but just to ensure that we don't get another nuclear Chernobyl in the event of a strike on the power plants. So IAEA has been doing a terrific job, and they are very technocratic. To my mind, there shouldn't be a kind of political overlay here. They are experts, they know what they're doing, and we need them for nuclear safety first and foremost.
Yes, please, in the front row.
Thank you, Rose. James Crawford from CBUS Super. I just want to take you up on your offer to talk about Asia and presumably South Korea and Japan being interested in developing their nuclear arsenal as well.
Yes, that's quite a burning question right now, and it gets to the question about the reliability of the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent. I think it's very ironic because at this moment, the United States has completed the modernization of the extended nuclear deterrence capabilities in Europe, in NATO Europe. The Trump administration in its first term and also the Biden administration sunk millions of dollars into upgrading the nuclear storage facilities and the base network in Europe for the so-called nuclear sharing arrangements there, and also put a lot of national treasure into the B-6112. It's a modernization of an existing variant of the B-61, B-6112. All of those warheads are now in Europe. And finally, and most importantly, when I was DSG of NATO, NATO allies were not yet buying the F-35, which is the dual-capable aircraft. It can be certified for both nuclear and conventional missions. The Germans were still arguing about it, for example. That was only 5 years ago. Now, all of the nuclear basing states in Europe have agreed to buy the F-35, and some of them have even proceeded to get it certified for the nuclear mission. The Netherlands recently got their F-35 certified. So the nuclear extended deterrent in Europe is in terrific shape, but the main question is aroused by, as it's perceived now, the lack of predictability and even reliability of President Trump and his administration. And it was not in the demands that the president has been placing on the allies to raise defense spending. That started in his first term, and I saw it at firsthand, again, as DSG of NATO, the way he swept into NATO headquarters and demanded that the allies pay up. That was the shock in the first administration. The shock this time was that the president seemed to shift sides, go from supporting the Ukrainians in their fight against Russian aggression to supporting the Russians and saying to the Ukrainians, get on board. This was the message from the terrible Oval Office meeting now 3 weeks ago. So that has been the real shock to the confidence of the allies in Europe. I know it's affected the allies here in Asia as well, and it has definitely intensified the debate, particularly in the ROK, I think more than in Japan at this moment, but in the ROK. Do we need to build and acquire our own nuclear weapons in order to have a nuclear deterrent full stop, not depending anymore on extended nuclear deterrence provided by the United States, but just build up our own nuclear capability? And you see those voices now being raised in Germany and in Poland, as well as here in Asia. So it is a delicate and extremely difficult moment. That's why I said, I think Mr. Hegseth, not only Mr. Hegseth, the president himself needs to start to articulate publicly our continued commitment to extended nuclear deterrence for both NATO Europe and our Asian allies. It's a critical moment. Otherwise, I do fear, I'm concerned that we could see proliferation among US allies.
Ladies and gentlemen, that takes us out for today. I'm afraid we've run out of time.
It's kind of depressing. Couldn't we have a...
There haven't been that many laughs, it has to be said today, but you've provided a few, Rose, and I think we'd all agree that was a powerful display. Thank you, Rose, and would you please join me in thanking Rose Gottemoeller?